Welcome to the second episode of the special Zoom edition of Beyond the Classroom. On our last episode, we spoke with Matt Kay, author of Not Light But Fire, about creating an environment that can reliably support effective race discussions and how to build quality relationships within your classroom. Welcome back, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now that we've set the container and committed to continuous self-reflection and developing our interpersonal skills, let's flesh out, how do we structure these conversations? I'd love it if you could start by talking to us about whole class, small learning communities, and one-on-one conversations. What's involved with each of them?
Well, I think each one of those structures that are all fairly traditional now, we have your whole class conversation, your small group conversation, your one-on-one conversation. I didn't invent any of those things, but all I tried to do in the book is try to give us some pathways for reflecting on those things and reflecting on our habits during race conversations and all conversations when we're using those tools. I don't have enough time to go through all of them, but just for instance, I make a big deal about cold calling in a whole class. Sometimes there is a traditionally accepted success that we have when, there's a fun little Key and Peele sketch that I always show when I'm doing a professional development on this. But essentially, it's about when there's a quiet kid, a shy kid in the back of the room, and a teacher looks at them and says, oh, they have an idea. They're just too shy to raise their hand. And then they call on them, and the kid says an idea, and everyone's like, yay, and streamers go off, and balloons fall from the sky, and everyone feels fantastic. But in the book, what I tried to think about was, is that as awesome as I think it is? And reliably, like it might be for some people, but is it more complex than it might seem? And so what I did was I just asked. I asked the young lady, what was it like? And she described how in a class where a teacher cold calls all the time, what her spirit is like, what her heart is beating like. And it was nothing she described was anything close to what a caring educator would intentionally inflict on their students. Right. And I know it's just one off, it's one case, but I know I make another case, I stutter. And I know when I was a kid, I know any teacher that cold called me, I viscerally hated them for the rest of the year. Yeah. Because it was horrible. That experience is absolutely horrible. And it's embarrassing. The teacher, I could see them patting themselves on the back. And for me, it was like, you did not do what you think you did in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so while every kid is not the same, I do want us to reflect on all of these procedures that we have, especially as it relates to race conversations, and say, how does this help or hurt my intention? And so that's what I tried to do in the book.
Yeah, and I thought that was a great point about the cold calling. I can remember, and I tell my students this at the beginning of the year, whenever there was a presentation or you were kind of doing popcorn style with a reading, let's say, for example, I was so focused on getting called on and so anxious about getting called on that I didn't even hear the rest of the conversation. Like I was tuning it out. So you're missing the essential learning or the critical learning that goes on because you're so uptight about what's about to happen. It's the same thing for me with pop quizzes. Like pop quizzes just make kids really, really nervous, and now it's not about the validity of what's happening and what they've actually learned. It's about their nerves. So what do you want to showcase? Do you want it to be a showcase of nerves and anxiousness, or do you want it to showcase actual thought and knowledge? So I thought it was a great point. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it with specificity to the race conversations. You made a point in the book to talk about when we are having race conversations in the classroom, this could actually, and you're talking about, something like cultural appropriation, for example, this could actually come off as being violent to a student and putting them in a position where it's almost violent for them. How can we as teachers use trauma-informed teaching to avoid this scenario?
Well, I think there's a few ways. I think the first thing is Yeah, there's a few ways. One is by careful orientation, like we mentioned in the last episode. If you are really studying your kids, like you know your kids, you know their histories, you know what they're about, you know what they've been through as a community, and you make that your most important inquiry, then you have a better idea. You won't be perfect, but you have a better idea of what kind of orientation they need before encountering something, like how you introduce something. I know one of the biggest rookie mistakes that I would apologize to any student I taught in the first part of my career, one of the biggest rookie mistakes was this idea of shock and awe. You show them a resource to grab their attention and of great emotional impact. Now, for many things you're discussing, that's not a problem. But a lot of times the way I did it was kind of emotionally manipulative. They came into my classroom not expecting that at all. They came in expecting, they just talked with their girlfriend and boyfriend outside. They were just hanging out. They played basketball. They come in my class, they're in a good mood, and they leave crying, and I feel like I did something. Mm-hmm. And that's violent. I think that if I know my kids, I have a better idea of of how to orient. Now, I can't get into too many specifics because every classroom is different and every community is different. What I push in the book is this idea that this shock and awe thing is not good, especially when it involves race conversations. You need to be well versed in what your students are going through,
right,
and care deeply about it, and then tailor everything towards that.
Right, and that makes sense. I mean, trauma-informed teaching is that, where safety is the most essential component of how you're showing up and what you're talking about. That every kid feels that at a palpable level in the classroom if they're going to be able to engage with you on these conversations. What questions should be asked when trying to decide what race subjects should be discussed in the classroom? You made mention of this in the first episode with curriculum. I'd like to go into a little bit more detail about that because I think it's too easy that, again, well-intentioned people want to have these conversations, but they go for an angle that's maybe overdone, or they're too narrow in their scope about how they approach it, instead of the wide variety of topics that can be touched about when talking about race.
Well, I think the biggest thing I would think about is trying to use race as a lens. An example that I don't think was in the book. I teach my 10th graders Lord of the Flies. It's the first book we read. And there's not one person of color in Lord of the Flies. It's a white book. It's a bunch of little white boys who go to an island. And on the surface, there's nothing, race. There's no race in this book. Unless you apply a thoughtful race lens, and then you see race all over this book. Because, for instance, when William Golding, when the author decides to have the kids act more savage to prove his point about humanity being more savage, his go-to signifier that they are getting more savage is having them act like stereotypes of indigenous people.
Right.
They get less British and more like Native Americans, the more savage they get. And when you apply that, they paint their faces, they do dances, they do all those kind of things. And the fact that was his pathway to make his point about how savage we are, that was so racialized. And there's even lines in the book that says, we're the British are the best at everything. Like he makes a very clear delineation between people of color who are savage and white people who are not. And if you white people don't fix yourselves, you're going to end up like those brown people. If you take that lens, it's hard to go back to discussing Lord of the Flies without engaging race. And all I ask teachers to do is to apply issues of race as a lens to talk about many of the things that they talk about, because then not to consider that forced. It's not forced. That's what Golding was doing. Like that's not a teacher putting their politics on it. That's exactly his thesis. It's uncomfortable, but that's his thesis. That's why he wrote the book. And so race as a lens, I think, is the simplest way to answer that. It's not just about reading books by people of color, though we should. It's not just about reading books with characters of color, though we should. It's not just about discussing issues in the inner city, though we should. It's more about where does giving race its justice as a lens that is worth study and worth applying to everything that we look at.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. Can you explain the two parts of the preacher's dilemma?
Well, see, I don't have my book in front of me, so I don't remember quite how I delineated into two parts. But I think what I was speaking about with the preacher's dilemma essentially is any preacher of any religious faith of some sort would recognize this idea of there is something that you find incredibly important, like so important, and everyone else around you kind of might be like, nah, it's not that important. And a preacher's biggest challenge is saying, like, these scriptures that we're looking at are the most important thing in the history of ever, and you need to govern your life accordingly. And people show up every week to hear you say a similar version of that. And your whole goal is to try to convince them that it is as important as you say it is, right? And so race is the same thing, right? Sometimes we can look at something and say, if you do not understand how this society is set up, your life will have drastic implications of, your ignorance is going to hurt you on this issue. You need to know how people in charge are hurting you. You need to know these issues of privilege and how they're impacting your life. And the kids are like, like, and that's what I think is our challenge, because we see something through our unique perspective that is so important. And our jobs when it comes to race conversations is making it feel something for the kids, so the kids can come even close to recognizing how important it is.
Right. One of the topics that you talked about in the book that I really appreciated you touching upon was called February soup. Can you talk to us a little bit about February soup?
Yeah. That is, the way we handle, for instance, race is more than black and white. But I think Black History Month is a good example. Is a lot of, because of the way schools and our culture handles Black History Month, there's a lot of kids who think that like Frederick Douglass and Rosa Parks rode the bus with Martin Luther King and W.B. Du Bois, and then Rosa stood up, and then racism died. And also the slaves were free. Same day. It was a very powerful day. And it's something that we can giggle at and say, all these kids, this generation, blah, blah, blah. But then once we reflect on that, we would think, why on earth would they think anything different? Because everything is piled into one moment and discussed in one moment. And in the absence of meaning, in the absence of connection to their lives, and with the constant repetition of the same stories, it makes total sense that kids would imagine a very linear before and after when it comes to racism, and then say things like back in racism times, which is this era of like black and white meanness that every once in a while they make a movie about. And then, but that is essentially our fault as an education system and as a society, that kids are allowed to lump everything into what I call this February soup. This idea of there's all these names, all these occurrences, and all these things, and it's not anything palatable. It's nothing that people that kids want to actually engage. It's tasteless, it's bland, and so that's what I mean by that.
Yes, and there's been a lot of comments that I've heard people say, well, why would you pick the shortest month of the year to do this? Why isn't it more well thought out and delivered in a different way? Because I feel like people do think that this is this hodgepodge of the same stories over and over again, rather than really seeing the differences between these individuals and the importance and the essence of their stories. We miss
Absolutely. Now, I'm super nervous because I'm definitely not an anti-Black History Month guy. Like, right. I think so many people put in so much effort to even get to,
of course,
to having that. But at the same time, I think the way it impacts our lives as educators is this jamming effect, where it's like the only time we talk about brown people is February.
Right.
The only time we talk about women is during Women's History Month. The only time we talk about, like, the only time we're purposeful about certain things is during that time. That's where I find it being the problem. I think if we talk about brown people all year and then we really talk about brown people in February, there's no problem. But my issue is we can't jam it all into one moment. It's how it impacts our lives as educators.
Absolutely. You state that one of the biggest challenges we have is to ensure that our race conversations always have clearly recognized and respectable purpose. How does owning our personal catalysts play into this and become imperative in having purpose and ensuring purpose for our students?
Yeah, I think I won't get into all of them, but I think we just have to be honest with ourselves about why we're having a conversation. I list the beginning of that chapter just talking about there are a bunch of reasons. Like, we talk about race to be popular in our group of, liberal friends. We do it because it lets us be funny in the classroom. We do it because there's an elephant in the room. We do it because, et cetera, et cetera. I give a bunch of us-centered reasons. We do it to be cool. We do it to any of those things. And I try to not bash those reasons because we're human, and I've been driven by all of those and will continue to be. But the problem is all of those are us-centered. And so if we're engaging on a tough, difficult, vulnerability requiring conversation with young people, it better not be because of something about us. It better not be because we read a book and we need to feel like we're doing something. And the biggest thing I ask in that book is that we look at some very clear ways that we can make sure kids know why we are doing such heavy lifting. And I talk about publishing. I talk about engaging a new line of inquiry. I just want kids to, I just want it to be communicated to kids. There's a reason I'm making you do this. There's a reason we're having this discussion. In addition to the academic ones that I mentioned in the other episode, like, also it's a powerful lens, and this is the best way to look at Lord of the Flies. There's also that. But in addition to that, there are larger reasons that are not just about me and my ego or my white guilt or my privilege guilt or my this, that I'm making you do this. I'm doing this because your lives will be better because you were brave enough to engage this conversation.
Right. One of the lines that really hit me in the book was, perhaps the complication isn't diversity, but a deadening sameness. What are some ways to handle this complication when the majority of your faculty and student body are the same?
I think that's in the context, if I remember correctly, of the conflict piece, yes. I think, I always own my experience. There's enough people pretending to know teachers' experiences out there, so I don't want to overstep my expertise. And I've worked in diverse classrooms and classrooms that are mostly kids of color. So I've not actually worked with 35 white kids in a room. That's not my experience. That said, I do think that my experience has a lot to say for that. And I think I wanted to be, that line was about those teachers recognizing that you can have conflicts too, even if all of your kids are white. Which for some reason, when I go around to speak with schools, they kind of turn a deaf ear and says, well, we don't have to worry about conflict in the classroom because we ain't got no brown kids. And I think that was just a line to put out there that that's not the case.
Right. Right.
That in fact, sameness in the spirit, especially in this current political climate, sameness can cause many conflicts. This idea that everyone feels a similar way about things and a similar upbringing when you are presenting some ideas to them.
Right. Right. No, I thought that was a beautiful point that you made. I wanted to talk to you about Jane Elliott's blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment. What are your thoughts on this experiment? And do you think that the only way to get enduring empathy is through firsthand experience of racism?
No, I do not. I don't have particularly passionate feelings about that experiment either way. I have passionate feelings about anyone saying the only to any answer. And I try not to do it myself. And that was my biggest edit when I was putting the book together. I was showing my wife and showing my editor, everyone, make sure I don't speak in absolutes, please. Make sure I don't speak in absolutes because there are none. And if you think that the only way for someone to truly be empathetic is to actually have gone through it, that becomes a bit of a problem because there's very few things that a white person can do to experience what a brown person goes through in this country. That doesn't make every white person bad. It doesn't make every brown person a victim. It says that we are all very, very different people. And a big part of growing empathy is not just about sharing an experience. It's about really loving your neighbor and being willing to listen to them and to acknowledge as truth what they say is true about their feelings and their emotions, and making those connections that way. I think activities that put people in shoes are good. Nothing, they can be dangerous if mishandled, but so are most classroom things. But you can't say the only, because that's inhibiting. And if a teacher is not willing to do it, or their administrator doesn't give them coverage to do it, or their community, et cetera, then they feel like, okay, I'm off the hook. I don't have to do any empathy building activities. And then,
Yeah. So I agree with that. So much of empathy is about saying, hey, I've had a set of experiences and you've had a different set of experiences. And I'm so glad we've both had these experiences in ways that can nurture our conversations. And thank you for sharing with me and allowing me to be with you as you share it, as opposed to me trying to jump in where I have no business jumping in,
Yeah, that could be dangerous. Like you could be in a place where I did this activity one time and I get racism. Like that's rough. You're I did this activity once and now I know what it feels like to be street harassed. It's like, no, you don't. You do not. And so I think there is value. I don't want to bash any thoughtful activity and there's value, but it's not an absolute.
Right. COVID-19, obviously we're living in an unprecedented time here. How has race played into the conversations that we've been having currently? And do you think that this is an opportunity for reset? And by that, I mean, how will it change the way race plays into conversations in the future once we emerge from this?
Well, it depends. I mean, the brutal facts of it is it's going to hurt brown communities more than it hurts white communities. It does not take away from the pain that many white families are feeling. But because of, all the systemic issues that are in this country, when it's all said and done, the percentages will be different when it's all said and done. And so there's that. So when you're taking a trauma-informed lens, there's that. The larger issue I see, besides in dealing with that and making sure we're building up and not just including our zero tolerance, we have to catch all these brown kids up because they miss so much school and we're not dealing with their trauma, which will be a temptation. We have to not do that as an answer. But more so, we gotta find our way as educators to be okay with facts. And we're teaching in a world where if a teacher were to walk up to their board and write "a fact is a fact" on the board, some parents might call and say, stop politicizing this education. That's where we are. And you can see that in a big way when it comes to the way we're engaging this pandemic. Because we are so instinctively against facts and expertise, more people are dying. And I think as educators, we have to shoulder a little bit of that and make sure our classrooms are spaces where the fact is king. And our classrooms are a place where kindness is king. And we don't think it's political to say a fact is a fact. We don't think it's political to say we should be kind to each other. We don't think it's political to say that lives matter. And Black lives matter, brown lives matter, women's lives matter, and that it's not a political statement. It's just a kind thing to do. We have to make a stand because we're seeing a very ugly side effect of people just not taking that stand. And then all of a sudden we have a generation that doesn't know what a fact is. That's scary.
Very, very scary. So what's next on the horizon for Matthew K? Because I think we're about to go big time here. that's my opinion.
I'm gonna keep my hard hat on, and I'm gonna keep teaching these kids. That's my deal. I keep telling everybody, I'm most happy when I'm teaching my kids, and so I haven't found a job that's gonna make me happier than teaching my kids. So. As much as I can keep writing, as much as I can keep working with colleagues all over the country, as much as I can keep, building and trying to show people that, we can have meaningful conversations about race, I'm going to keep doing that. But when this season of my life is over, I'm still going to be in room 211 with 31 kids trying to get them to read my book and have a good conversation.
That's awesome. So,
yeah.
I'm in room 211 too.
Oh, yay.
Woo! There's good people in 211.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and that warms my heart. And I want to thank you. I said this to you when we spoke on the phone. Just thank you for writing the book that we have all needed to read for many, many years. It really, it was the book I couldn't put down. I've read it 3 times now. That's probably why I can tell you page numbers.
Yeah, I was like, oh.
Yes, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to seeing many great things from you in the future.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This is Diana Ahl, reminding you to always take life's learnings beyond the classroom.